Thank you to John Tain and to Iftikhar Dadi and to Lahore Biennale for so generously inviting me here. It's fine for them. Thank you. To join the Climate Congress. It's my first time in Pakistan, and I'm really honored to be here, and thank you for everyone coming out on a Saturday night. Today's talk has two aims. The first aim is to give a brief history of Silk Road studies. I'll look at why people from so many different disciplines and backgrounds are interested in something called the Silk Road. This includes historians and economists, activists and artists, as well as literary scholars like me. The second aim is to ask how Silk Road studies might be a better resource for environmental thought. I'll propose that the Silk Road has, since the Industrial Revolution, played a part in humanity's environmental destruction of the planet. But I'll also argue that Silk Road studies has participated in forms of ecological thought at the same time. To explain how we humans as a species have been blind to what we've done to the planet, academics often blame a traditional split between historians who write about human history and scientists who write about natural history. Historians often blame their own discipline for producing human-centered histories that during the rise of the industrial age from the history of the planet. To repair this split between human history on the one hand and natural history on the other, between the world or globe versus the planet or Earth, historians have begun to rewrite hitherto anthropocentric histories of capitalism and colonialism, and we increasingly see interspecies histories that make animals, plants, and minerals historical characters with agency, or histories that reveal humans as geological agents who ravage the Earth. Now, at first glance, the Silk Road seems to be one such example of human-centered history. Take two standard histories of the Silk Road, published in the last decade. For Valerie Hansen on the top right there, she says, the Silk Road is the planet's most famous cultural artery for the exchange between East and West of religions, art, languages, and new technologies. For Peter Frankopan, the Silk Road is the bridge between East and West that's at the crossroads of civilization. Far from being on the fringe of global affairs, he's talking about Central Asia, these countries are at the very center. They are, as they have been since the beginning of history. And even a more flexible definition of the Silk Road, Yo-Yo Ma, the musician, says the Silk Road is a modern metaphor for sharing and learning across cultures, art forms, and disciplines. It's off the page there a little bit. So such historians do at times address the environment of Central Asia. But I'm going to go back today to the beginnings of Silk Road studies, around 150 years ago or so. And I'll try to show how in the 19th century, the Silk Road placed center stage humanity's relation to the environment. Unlike the modern history of capitalism or colonialism, the Silk Road has, since the 19th century, become a way of entangling human and natural history. In part one, we'll look at maps, mainly maps of trade and transport networks, connectivity maps we call them today, and I'll show how 19th century industrial geographers made the natural world part of the picture of human history for both good and bad reasons. And part two will focus on words, primarily loan words or words borrowed from foreign languages. For example, in English, words like pajamas or biryani borrow the sound of Urdu words into English. And I'll show how 20th century philologists or literary scholars made the history of fruit and vegetables part of the history of human languages. So let me begin with the term Silk Road. This is my sort of working timeline of select published uses of the term Silk Road in a few languages and places around the world. And I apologize in advance that Urdu is not up there. As you can see, the Silk Road is not an ancient term. It's a strictly modern term that actually begins in the 1830s in German, die Seidenstraße. And this timeline tracks the movement of the term across regions and languages. So in the 1830s, it begins in Germany. By the sort of 1880s, 1890s, it moves to Britain, France, and Europe, both East and Western Europe. The 50s and 60s, there is a reappropriation of the term, especially in Asia. And then from the 1990s onwards, it becomes very much a term that has standard translations in pretty much all global languages. And the reasons for that will become clear, hopefully, through the talk. Now, in Pakistan, there are sort of three main moments in which the term, and again, this is in Anglophone, in English, rather than Urdu, though I think it'll probably, from my conversations with other scholars, it's probably somewhat contemporaneous with what's happening in English. So what you get in the 1960s is the circulation of the Silk Route or Silk Road, very much in conjunction with China-Pakistan relations and the building of the Karakoram Highway as the reopening of the Silk Route. And that circulates in newspapers in Pakistan during the 60s and 70s. The second phase comes with UNESCO, the United Nations collaborative group, which includes Pakistan, China, parts of Africa and the Arab world, as well as Europe and North America, which includes a group of international scholars who decide to make the Silk Road into a studies, a sort of ex-studies, Silk Road studies. And this is where you really see in the arts, humanities, and sciences a lot of public funding for public education events. I was one beneficiary of that growing up, although I didn't know that at the time. A lot of exhibitions happen across the world. And from Pakistan, Ahmed Hassan Dani was one of the lead sponsors, organizers of this international collaboration. He led the Desert Route expedition in China and another in Central Asia in the 90s. And a lot of the scholarship that came out around the Taxila, but also Karakoram Highway and so forth, came out during this period. And so it's really to this period, to this UNESCO collaboration, that something called Silk Road Studies becomes a kind of boutique subfield in various places around the world. The third phase is what we are very much living with today. Since 2013, China's One Belt, One Road initiative. The Silk Road has become a sort of a global tag since then, and people such as Hassan Karar and others have studied this geopolitical, geoeconomic Silk Road in this context. And I'm not going to talk about Pakistan-China relations, or indeed any of these instances very much today. What I will be talking about is the sort of prehistory to this, or the kind of academic work that was around the fringes and leading in some parts of the world the discourses around the Silk Road. Now, if we take the same timeline that I showed you with different countries, if you read all these texts, as I've been doing over the last decade or so, you'll find that what's striking in the pattern of interest in the Silk Road is the discipline, the profession of those who are writing about the Silk Road. The expert or the authority on something called the Silk Road was, for the first century of this term Silk Road, geography. It was the geographer. If you'd studied the Silk Road, more than likely you were a geographer. And it's only in the 20th century that the term migrates to other disciplines. You get it in history, philology, art history, the arts, and especially diplomacy. Once we hit the 1980s, and especially with the UNESCO project, it's really all over the place, including in the sciences. And what I want to do for this first half is to pause a little on this early phase of geographical interest in the Silk Road. So again, in this first century of the term, the first conceptualizations of something called the Silk Road came from professional, largely German-speaking geographers who visualized the Silk Road as a map. So the first Silk Road concept was not a philosophical concept. It wasn't a question of what is the Silk Road. It wasn't a question of when was the Silk Road. It was a question, as you see down here in the 1940s in the London Times Fireside Questions, it's a question of where the Silk Road went. And to answer that with the most authority and accuracy, you drew a map. So the first concept of the Silk Road was visual. It was not verbal. To explain what the Silk Road was in the 19th century and even through to the early 20th century, you drew a map, and that was your version of the Silk Road. And the two people I'll talk very briefly about is Ferdinand von Richthofen, who was the geographer who first conceptualized and first pictured the Silk Road on the map you can see there. And then his student Sven Hedin, a Swedish geographer, who then popularized the term in largely sort of East Asia and Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And very briefly, this is the first Silk Road map from 1877. And it's a bringing together of ancient Chinese and ancient Greek materials in order to map out a route between Western China and Afghanistan that would be part of a future railway between Europe and China. Of course, that was only realized in the 21st century. But back then in 1872, Richthofen said, little doubt can exist that eventually China will be connected with Europe by rail. Now, the first thing that's interesting about Richthofen, he was the first to take ancient Chinese cartography, ancient Chinese maps seriously. And the Chinese mapping cartographic tradition begins here. He looked to a set of maps that are often called maps of the footsteps of you. This began 4,000 years ago when China had its great flood. And geologists have, in the past actually few years, they found data to accurately date this sort of legendary flood that happened in the first Xia dynasty of China to 1920 BCE. And as legend has it, Emperor Yu, after the flood, dredged out waterways, a kind of irrigation system across China, establishes the dynasty that way. And what you get is a map-making tradition of the footsteps of Yu, the tracks of Yu, as he's irrigating waterways through China. That is, there is a relationship between the natural environment and the human map of countries and so forth that's already built into, as you can see from the sort of landscape, traditional Chinese landscape painting on the far right there, that's already built into this idea of what should be on a map, or what's the use of a map. Now, if we return to Richthofen in 1877, in which he's trying to map out a future railway, a future transport infrastructure using ancient transport routes. This was, his map was part of a series that he produced after, in the 1860s, he led the first large-scale geological survey of China. So he mapped out where all the coal fields are, which has sort of dramatically changed what China looks like since then. And this area of northern China, some of you know, Shandong, is coal-rich. And that is where he directed Germany to seize the first mainland Chinese colony in 1897, based on this map that you see here, Richthofen's map. Now, what was interesting about Richthofen's maps is you'll look at them, they're not political maps. You don't see countries and borders. What you see is the geophysical landscape mapped there, the sort of height, the steppes, the oases and so forth, color-shaded, and here the minerals color-shaded there. Richthofen said, if you can see at the bottom here, it should always be kept in mind that the first and foremost subject of scientific geography is the Earth's surface, independent of its organization and its inhabitants. Now, this early Silk Road commitment to the Earth with or without its inhabitants, to thinking about the history of the planet, is very much center stage for his student Sven Hedin, who in the 1920s and 30s spearheaded an effort to, between the Swedish and Chinese nationalist government then, to build a motor road, not a railway, but a motor road between Europe and China. As he says on the far right there, China's ancient Silk Road will become a motorway. Now, what Sven Hedin drew attention to as a geographer was in the area that you see circled in yellow there, had a geological history a phenomenon that was called the Wandering Lake. It's a geological phenomenon in which surface erosion by wind makes the path of the Tarim River, you can see there, and also on his Silk Road map, which is in China's Gobi Desert, cyclically alternate courses, terminating in two possible lake beds. Now, the reason why this matters is because, if you can see at the bottom here, 200 BCE, which is sort of beginning of the Han Dynasty Silk Road, this Tarim River and Lake Lop Nor in China's Gobi Desert wanders southwards. And this has a dramatic consequence for Silk Road history because the oasis city of Lowland, which is what looks like that today, dries up, it's abandoned as the river wanders north. And so that whole segment of the Silk Road disappears. So sort of end of the Silk Road in that part of China. And in 1920, the river wanders back again. So in the 1920s, Hedin calls to revive the Silk Road with a new motorway. So what's at stake here, in which this sort of the pendulum of the Tarim River is measured by the clock of geological time. The point of these maps for Sven Hedin is to see the relationship between natural history and human history, put them on the same map, but to master, to make humans into the geological agent who can transform that landscape into an industrial high-speed transport network. Now, we're familiar with this kind of interest in transport infrastructure and connectivity maps of the kind you've just seen with Richthofen and Hedin. In some ways, Parag Khanna says the true map of the world should feature not just states, but megacities, highways, railways, pipelines, internet cables, and other symbols of our merging global networks, civilization, as you can see here. Now, my point in bringing that up is to show how actually different that modern connectivity map is from what the connectivity map looked like in the 19th and early 20th century. So what was strange about the 19th century, early 20th century geographer, wherever they were in the world, is that there was a historical imagination. So back then, Richthofen and many other geographers actually wrote 1,000-page histories of modern transport networks. So they looked back to ancient texts and tried to place modern shipping and railway lines into a deep, multi-millennia long history. Unlike today, these geographers put antiquity as well as nature on the map. So here, this is a sort of typical, it looks like a regular connectivity map here, but the pink and blue lines are currents which change with the monsoon, seaweed, cold currents, warm currents. This is the most up-to-date connectivity map. And as you can see on a British geographer, John Yates's map of ancient and modern commercial routes in 1872, I think you can see with Lahore and Taxila there, he's mapping together both ancient, I think in red, and modern in blue, in black transport routes together. So it was familiar then to put the two together and try to see what's happened in between. Richthofen's Silk Road map has ancient routes. Hedin's map has a mixture of ancient and modern. And that was far more common in the 19th century. And so very briefly, what I'm trying to outline here is a whole subfield or subgenre that is no longer around. We no longer have something called histories of trade and transport, in German Verkehrs- und Handels- und Verkehrsgeschichte, in which geographers who were irrigating the world were also writing multi-millennia long histories of Babylonian to Panama Canal. In Britain, for example, Henry Yule, who did a lot of canal and irrigation work in Bengal, he helped promote the publication of nearly 200 books called The Histories of Commercial Intercourse or Histories of Navigation. And in Germany, you get textbooks like that. And what's important is to see the Silk Road histories that are coming out as part of this genre of historicizing the modern transport networks. It's a slightly strange genre that, again, we don't have anymore. And what's interesting is nowadays we're familiar, for those who are writing and working with environmental history, to organize chapters or organize events around an ocean or a sea. the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, or around a continent or a route network like the Silk Road. They were doing that back then as part of an interest in the history of transport. But what's striking is that during industrialization, this genre of maps and histories taught humans how to conquer the geophysical and climatic constraints through industrial transport. They were kind of aids to the Anthropocene, to the age in which humans are profoundly affecting, deranging the earth. And they naturalized this history of humans as potent geological agents. I just want to very briefly point to a reaction amongst geographers to this mode of wanting to master the earth through transport geography. And Élisée Reclus, who was a colleague of Richthofen, was an anarchist geographer who wrote The Earth and Its Inhabitants. And this is in the 19th century, before we have the spaceship looking at the globe. They argued the need to see the history of the human and planet as one. In Reclus' terms, man is nature becoming self-conscious. And the Silk Road, in this iteration, is part of the progress of solidarity with races and with the planet ecosystem. And again, very briefly, some of you will know George Marsh, who Reclus tried to translate, who was one of the earliest to give a scientific warning of the power of man to irreparably derange the combinations of inorganic and organic life in the 1860s. And he was a transport commissioner. He worked with railways. And for him, transport history begins in antiquity, but only modern industrial transport and mining has this massive, unprecedented kind of influence on the earth. And those are some of the ways in which he saw the earth being transformed. So I've talked a little bit about geography and the central place of natural history in it. And now I want to talk more or less for the rest of my talk about history and philology. Philology, again, is sort of the study of languages and literature, sort of split between linguistics and literary studies now. And in thinking about how we undo this division between human history of the world and natural history of the planet, I'll look at how historians reappropriate the Silk Road maps of geographers in the 20th century. And then I'll talk a bit about what philologists are doing with the history of language contact and words. So in the 20s to 60s, historians start reappropriating, rewriting, repairing the kind of Silk Road history that European colonial geographers wrote. In the 1920s to 1960s, a few women historians were very keen to rewrite Silk Road history. And actually, the first book entitled The Silk Road that was not written by a geographer was by a woman historian, Luce Boulnois, whose Silk Road history, very much as with Sophia Chen's Silk Road history, they began Silk Road history with the Chinese empress who invented sericulture. And they shifted attention from the circulation of silk to women's labor in silk production. Now, just to recall, when we look at those maps of connectivity, ancient or sort of from the 19th century or the 21st century, the focus is on economic circulation, not economic production and consumption. And so what was going on in drawing attention to the laborers who produced export product that could then be exported along and give the name to the Silk Road. In turning attention to production, they shifted the ways in which one thinks of Silk Road as a kind of economic history. So that's one way in which the sort of repair of the Silk Road happened. And what happened, and I think there's some space here in the future to think with this effort to think about the silk production in the history of the Silk Road, is the bringing together of natural and human history in thinking about the Silk Road as an interspecies history. It's the mulberry tree, the silk worker, as well as the silkworm. There's the plant, animal, human, mineral. This Silk Road puts interspecies history in conversation with global histories of capital that read the Silk Road as part of either the beginnings of globalizing capital, or as a prehistory, a pre-modern version of archaic globalization that's very different from the other. So from whatever perspective one thinks about the Silk Road as already modern or very pre-modern, either way, one has a different way of thinking about the Silk Road as a bringing together of the history of the silkworm in relationship to the gendered and raced worker who puts the silk in circulation. And finally, I want to turn to historians in Asia and Africa, and I can only talk very briefly here, who, especially in the 50s and 60s, but also even before then, started taking these ideas, the Silk Road, the history of contact, these sort of subfield and subgenres that were already circulating and rewriting them in very different ways. And one important way in which Asian Africa historians, especially through the post-Bandung Afro-Asian movement in the 50s and 60s, was to take these histories and maps and recenter what was often a Europe-centered or sometimes China-centered discourse around connectivity and to shift the centers elsewhere. So at the top here, and I'll talk about this a little bit, in Pakistan, we get histories of navigation and relations. In China, there's histories, it's 中外交通史, it's histories of communications between China and the outside world. It becomes a new genre, a new subfield. It's still live and kicking. In Tanzania, I won't really talk about. In East Africa, we get new histories of pre-colonial times that is in conversation with connectivity around early and then obviously the later histories of enslavement. And I won't talk about that today. I'll just focus on one small network of scholars who are interested in thinking about recentering these connected histories so they are inclusive of Islam. And the one person I wanted to draw attention to is a Chinese Muslim scholar who was born in China in 1912 called Hai Weilia, who's known in Urdu as, excuse my accent, Badruddin Chini, and he also had an Arabic name he's known in Arab world by. And he studied in the 1920s and 30s in India, the Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi, and then Aligarh Muslim University, and then in Lucknow, and then he traveled to Azhar University in Cairo in the 1930s and 40s. And he came back, oh no, he didn't come back, he stayed and he published this important book, Sino-Arab Relations and Their Consequences. He published it in Urdu in Karachi in 1949 and in Cairo, but he didn't publish it in Chinese or English, actually. Now, what's important about Badruddin Chini is that he was part of a set of scholars. Suleiman Nadvi was, I believe, one of his teachers when he was in India in the 20s, 30s, who'd already written about Indo-Arab relations, talukat, and he wrote a similar version of that, but in relationship to China. And also one of the main scholars that he draws on is Hadi Hassan, whose History of Persian Navigation became very influential, and is part of a set of scholarship that comes out there that, unlike some of the earlier work, becomes more inclusive of Persian and Arabic sources, includes Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, trade and cultural relations. And one of the things that Hadi Hassan in particular talks about is how the Persians were the initiators of trade with the Far East. Now, it's important also to note that these histories that were being produced differed from the kinds of histories of India-China relations that were being produced in India, especially post-partition, that mainly centered on Sino-Indian relations based on ancient Buddhist journeys. So it's a different discourse and very different local instantiations of what the Silk Road or what connectivity looks like. Now, what I want to spend the rest of my talk in the small amount of remaining time that I have is talking about the interest amongst these historians, but also amongst professional philologists, people who worked on linguistic studies, on the language of connectivity, the language of contact, and a way of seeing language as relics of both natural history and human history. So if you could, I'm not sure I can read this. Let me, 1 second, I think I might have to walk over here. If you can see in the top right here, again, this is Hadi Hassan. He's quoting another scholar which says, there were probably a number of distinct lakes, now patches of salt desert, which are spoken of in the popular legends of Persia as a vast sea extending from Qazvin in the north and so forth. The modern word for a swamp has thus come to be identical for the ancient word for sea. And the Zereh of Sverdosi, therefore, is not the Sistan depression of today, but the great inland sea of prehistoric time. So giving the history of language, the history of navigation, what these scholars are pointing to is a history of the natural world. And a second way that this becomes important, turn this off, is looking at this category of loanwords that I'll talk about. So here he says cinnamon is called in Arabic, I can't read that, but let me try again. Darsini, dar is a Persian word meaning wood, and the same with nut and nutmeg. And so he says, sorry, it's therefore a Chinese wood, or the wood coming from China. So the ways in which language, the words that are either in Urdu or Arabic or Persian or in Chinese register a past history in ways that you don't have to look at histories of actual people to reconstruct. Sorry, let me just go forward. Now, just to say a little more about loanwords, they're a word adopted or borrowed from another language, and they often serve within linguistics as the prototype of what happens when you have languages in contact. And I'll talk a little bit more about this and its importance in a minute. But an example from the ancient world is the Chinese word for silk, si, which travels through Mongolian and into English, but also into ancient Greek, which is unusual. It seems to be the only Chinese loanword in ancient Greek or Latin, serica in Latin. Nowadays, we're very familiar with loanwords in English, which is has a ton of loanwords in there. You get a sense of, so English loanwords from Urdu, bungalow, biryani, coolie, kebab, kaki, loot, and so forth. English loanwords from Chinese, chop suey, dim sum, tea, ginseng, kowtow, and so forth. You get a sense of the kinds of words that get borrowed across languages. Now, what's important and slightly strange and unexpected is when you go through this sort of dusty scholarship around language contact that was happening in the 19th and 20th centuries, you'll find a huge interest in plants, fruit, and veg. You get these books like Sino-Iranica, in which every chapter is dedicated to a fruit or veg, the grapevine, the pistachio, the walnut, and so forth. And they talk about the borrowings from Persian or from other languages, as you can see there. And you have these lexicons of loanwords in which the fruit or veg is the prototype. Now, this may seem very sort of erudite and divorced from the world. And China in the 1950s and 60s, it became part of state-sponsored scholarship. And in the front page, well, in the sort of the state newspapers, there were regular histories of fruit and veg as they exemplified China's historical relations with Arabic in particular. So, for example, here, Ma Jian, who is a very well-known Chinese Muslim scholar, and he's sort of writing in the People's Daily in Rabat. He says, he talks about the transcriptions of ancient Arabic terms, frankincense, myrrh, fenugreek, tea leaves, and then over there you can see rosewater, henna, fenugreek, and so forth. You get a sense of the kind of strange and quirky kinds of stories that come to represent something as big as, China's relationship with the Arab world or something like that. Now, the stakes of this, I'd like to propose, have to do with two different ways of approaching the history of the world's languages. One is genetic history, with which we may be more familiar, and the other is non-genetic or social affective history. With genetic history, the unit of analysis, I'll get into this in a minute, is the word root, and then in non-genetic history or language contact, it's the loan word.
So from the 19th century to the 20th century, really until the 1980s, this was the dominant way of organizing language history. And it's still useful and used today by linguists, obviously. But it was much more dominant and back then. And there's a way of comparative philology, as it was called then, or comparative linguists, of organizing the languages of the world into family trees by their genetic relatedness. So here you can see what's called Aryan there, but what's called Indo-European. You have Persian and Sanskrit related to Latin and Greek, and then Hindi, Urdu would be up there. Versus, and you move over to the Semitic, you have Arabic there, and then Chinese, they still didn't have a name for that at the beginning of the 20th century. Chinese is in another family, not related. Histories do not overlap in any ways. You can't represent contact because these are histories of ancestral descent. So the way in which you construct these trees very quickly is to find word roots and then cognate. So for example, in English you have mother, Latin mater, Sanskrit mater, and so you can, through linguists can analyze that and show through that initial sound, there's a kind of relatedness that's important. And in this mode of giving a history, analyzing scientifically the world's languages, the most important way of establishing a national grammar is to look at the inflection of verbal roots, I am, you are, and so forth. And the understanding there was that Chinese language doesn't inflect at all. So again, it's a sense of non-relatedness. Now, this use of the tree, and that's why it's sort of interesting for this conference, was as an organizing metaphor for plants, animals in biology, for human races in ethnology, and for languages in philology and linguistics. And as many post-colonial and environmental scholars have argued, this form of organizing life and non-life into trees was part of a colonial endeavor, colonial botany, in which plant taxonomy provided order that colonizers sought to organize the natural world. And as you can see here, philology relied on a lot of these metaphors. So we've had root, we've had tree, but also etymons, descent, ancestor, mother language, pure, mixed, hybrid, and so forth. There's a whole language of genetics relatedness that divorced plants from natural history, because it's pure metaphor, pure abstraction, and divorced language from social history at the same time. Now the oppositional, another lens onto his thinking of the history of the world's languages is to think about them as always in contact with other languages. And since the 1980s, this has been called contact linguistics. And the aim is to study language contact and how languages change through borrowing. And they especially look at pidgins and creoles and commercial languages, for example, Indo-Portuguese or Lascari, the languages on ships and ports. And the argument that early scholars made that there's no such thing as a completely unmixed language that's always already mixed up through history. And again, so the difference between the genetic comparative philology is an interest in verbal roots. What you get in the study of language contact at the bottom there is an interest in loan words, especially nouns, and especially plants, spices, animals. These are the things that traveled and are at the core of the study of language contact. Now, a very small minority of scholars who were interested in the history of language contact, what the life of Silk Road languages felt and sounded like, it didn't use biological metaphors. It used commercial metaphors. So even the term loan word, use imported or exported words. You borrow, you adopt, you impose, you translate, you transfer. And in the beginning 19th, 20th century, there were actually the studies of something called languages of commerce. You can see the name of that map up there. Languages of necessity, slave languages, lingua franca, creoles, and so forth. And even the term pidgin English actually comes from the British person parodying how a Chinese pronounces business English, pidgin English. So you get the sense of this history of colonial contact that sustain different ways of looking at of the history of languages. And so I'll more or less end here to summarize that fruits and plants were the prototype of loanwords commonly used to explain the history of language contact, to explain Silk Road language and what it was like. And these histories of loanwords gave histories of actual plants, not metaphorical plants. And this kind of what you might call eco-philology provided a way of using the linguistic study of the Silk Road to give another, often unintended history of plant-human relations that offered an alternative to colonial botanical taxonomies. So you don't get the kinds of interest in native versus invasive species. And instead of, as we do still, call plants by their Latin names, these were interested in reconstructing names in classical Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, and so forth. So it's a different approach, and I'll end with that just to sum up. During the first 100 years of Silk Road studies, the natural world was always already there along with human history. Unlike histories of the world or histories of capitalism or colonialism, 19th century and early 20th century studies of the Silk Road did tend to entangle human history in the histories of winds, in deserts, and plants. In the 19th century, industrial geographers used Silk Road transport maps for anti-ecological purposes. Their maps helped turn humans into geological agents. They aided the human conquest of the environment. But they also prompted an explicit environmental protest. It came from railway commissioners. During the 20th century, the first generation of Silk Road historians and philologists sought to repair or rethink this geographer's Silk Road. Historians, especially in Asia, decentered Europe-centered Silk Roads, and their multipolar Silk Roads diversified the gender, culture, religious background of the subjects, and at the same time drew attention to the silkworms and plant life of the Silk Road. I propose that one might call eco-philology explained Silk Road language contact by producing somewhat whimsical, non-serious biographies of fruit and veg, and yet these humble fruit and veg, I suggest, offered an alternative of sorts to the genetic logic and the genetic taxonomies of colonial thought that divided languages and races and that enforced the very distinction between human and natural history. Thank you.